And for me, this is one of the most challenging sessions we have each year, because Dr. Roubini comes and tells us the 5 or 6 things that are worse than you think they are. And it's my job in real time to try to figure out what the solutions are, what could happen, so that those things don't come true. And this year is no different than any other. Nouriel's been traveling the world, checking things out at the grassroots level, and discovering that, yes, as he expected, they are worse than you think they are. And so this is kind of our lightning round of trying to make sure you're aware of what could be worse, and we try to present, as we do at all of our events at the Global Conference, and our theme that, okay, identifying a problem is a start, and now let's figure out how we can find a solution to the area that is being brought up. And so, Nouriel, why don't you start with the 5 or 6 things that could be worse than we think they are.
Okay, I'll discuss certainly what are the downside risks in the global economy, but I should say at the outset, of course, there are also some upside risk, and an objective assessment will have to consider what could go right as well, what could go wrong, and what are the policy solutions to the things can go wrong. So for every problem, there is also a solution. We'll have a chance to speak about it. And I would say among the positive things in brief order, there is a global economic recovery. There has been an asset price recovery. Emerging markets are going to be growing robustly for the next, not just years, but decades. There is a technological series of innovations that can increase productivity growth. The balance sheets and P&L of high-grade corporates are strong. And globalization is continuing in spite of threats and backlash against it. So there are some positives, and we can discuss those ones. What are the things that I worry about?
And the potential that the 20 or 30 trillion dollar increase in asset values could negate some of these problems. There's always that upside risk, right?
Yeah, the reflation of asset prices has occurred since 2009, certainly has a positive wealth effect on consumption, on investment, and so on. So that asset reflation is one that has occurred with the return of earnings and all the rest. And that's a positive, certainly, among other factors. What are the things we have to worry about? And of course, then you have to assign probabilities. There are tail risks, but then you have to discuss how likely they are. I would say the following ones, and you have to discuss them in some detail, each and one of them. The first one is that, of course, there is still a risk there's going to be a military confrontation between Israel and or United States and Iran on the issue of nuclear proliferation. They're doing negotiation right now. In my view, likely they might fail, then sanctions are going to be tightened. And the US now has said our official policy is not anymore containment, meaning using deterrence if Iran gets the bomb and accept it, but rather there is no containment policy. That means that if you cannot convince Iran, either through negotiation or sanction, to credibly and verifiably give up on a nuclear option, then after the election, because Obama doesn't want to attack before the election, but after the election, actually, there is a meaningful chance that US is going to do the job. People worry about Israel doing the job, but that could happen actually after the election, because the US has said containment is not our policy, and Obama has even said, I'm not bluffing. So at this point, his reputation is at stake. And certainly if Romney were to be elected, he would be as hawkish, if not more hawkish on this issue than Obama is. So that's a risk.
So I just want to get the timing. This is not something that you think is going to occur prior to November.
No, but the point is that if the negotiation fail, then there'll be a tightening of the sanctions, say, by the second half of the year. There is already a war of words between Israel on one side and Iran. There is already a covert war between the two sides, as Israel and the United States have allegedly tried to kill nuclear scientists, have tried to use cyber warfare to damage their nuclear facilities, and now Iran is talking back. They've tried to kill some Israeli diplomats around the world. They're threatening to block the Strait of Hormuz. They could unleash their own proxies, from Iraq to Hamas to Hezbollah and so on. So there are lots of things that Iran could do, even short, I would say, of an outright military confrontation. If the war of words and the covert war between the two sides were to escalate in the second half of the year, the fear premium Think of it, Brent used to be last year $90 per barrel, right now is 120, 125. That increase is not a supply and demand imbalance because there is meaningful supply and demand has been soft given weak economic growth in advanced economies. It's all a free premium. That free premium can go much higher and have a negative effect on global economic growth.
Okay, let's go to number 2.
Well, a related issue that is not just the Iran issue is that the entire Middle East, in some sense, is really a mess. It's not just the Iran-Israel question and nuclear proliferation. You had the Arab Spring starting in Tunisia, then spread to Egypt, then spread to Libya. All three of these countries are unstable. I don't think they're going to lead to democracy and having healthy economic conditions. If any, there is a risk of currency, sovereign, and financial crisis, starting with Egypt, a country of 80 million people. You have civil war in Yemen. You have civil war in Syria. You have restless Shiite minorities from Bahrain to Kuwait to the eastern province of Saudi Arabia. Jordan could be fragile and collapse. There are tensions between Turkey and Iran, Turkey and Syria, Turkey and Israel, between Israel and Palestinians. And we left Iraq, and look what happened. We left Iraq, and now the Kurds, the Shiite, and the Sunnis starting to kill each other again. So people said suddenly we'll have tons of oil coming from Iraq. It's not going to happen. So the entire Middle East, let alone moving further east towards what's happening in Afghanistan or Pakistan. So the wider Middle East, regardless of Iran, Israel, is a total mess. And it's going to remain a mess and a source of geopolitical risk for the global economy for many years to come. I mean, this Arab Spring is going to become an Arab winter in many ways.
Okay, so let's...
I think it's a meaningful risk, certainly.
Okay, so let's...
Are you optimistic about Egypt?
Let's address the... let's address these two together because they're somewhat related. We are fully aware in the United States that we had a wake-up call in 1973, 74 with the oil shock.
Yep.
People waited in line, you limited the amount of gas you could get, and the United States did not respond. Every president asked us, told us to go out and search for oil and that we would never import. But this really was nothing new. The areas of alternative energy, and 8 of them, that we could list separately, were identified long before as a challenge in this area. No different than smoking that was really identified first in 1939. That there was a report done by the Surgeon General, there might be a link between smoking and your health in 1939. Well, here is a look at 8 of these areas: expanded natural gas, hydropower, geothermal, oil shale, biomass and ethanol, tidal wave power, all of these technologies. What's so interesting is that all of these were explored by Fortune magazine in 1938. And so if you read that issue in 1938, you would see a full description of all of these 8 areas, similar to the announcement in 1939 that there was some link between smoking and your health. And they even thought of using natural gas in cars. It didn't look exactly like we would think about it, but this is a look of a drawing from 1938. That related. And so first area that I think is to identify the problem. Once we've identified the problem, we can go to work. And really commodities over long periods of time have not performed well relative to inflation. And so technology's with us today. And now the United States, based on technology, shale, coal, and everything else, has the most amount of energy reserves in the world, with Russia second and China third. All 3 of those obviously are not located in the Middle East, have an interest in exploring those and deploying technology. And if we look at where the shale reserves are today, based on what you've put forth here, very small amounts of the shale, identified shale basins around the world are in the Middle East or in Iran, etc. Yes, there are some in Libya and some in Algeria here that you can see, but the vast majority, when we look at the amount in the United States, the amount in Canada that we have, and that amount in Brazil, etc., there is a large storehouse of shale available to us with technology. And so I think the wake-up call that you've provided us It's taken a long time. It's taken, since the 1970s, but cigarettes took a long time too. And I think we're now at the point in time with this differential that everyone with this wake-up call, we might actually take action. And that if we have action, in addition to that in technology today, the Koreans, more than one Korean company has been introducing technologies that where you can just pump natural gas onto a ship, they will liquefy it on the ship, then the ship can move anywhere in the world, and then it does the reverse process. So obviously natural gas has dramatic changes in price between Korea, China, and the United States, and a resurgence of our chemical businesses and manufacturing business due to the fact that the U.S. is now one of the low-cost producers, that we might see natural gas moving around the world as these shale oil deposits. And lastly, we are fully aware of another area that you're going to list. But in the United States, it's been very difficult to move power. American Electric Power wanted to move power between West Virginia and Virginia. It took them 16 years to get regulatory approval, 15 for regulatory, 1 year to build. And so it's quite possible, no matter who wins the presidential election, that this country is going to be focused on energy. And the promises we made to the world in the 1970s with President Carter and all subsequent, that we would not import and that we would be an example of what the world can do. And if we look at those shale deposits that could take care of Latin America, North America, huge parts of Europe today, Australia, China, on the western part of China, South Africa, etc. If technology really pushes, we might substantially reduce our need for the product coming out of the Middle East.
Okay.
Your turn.
Okay, I would say the following thing. I mean, I certainly, if you take an horizon of the next 10, 20 years, I would say there may be an energy revolution driven by shale. That's a possibility, but if there's going to be a conflict between Israel and the US and Iran in the next 12 to 24 months, we're not yet at the stage in which that supply of shale gas is going to make a significant difference. There'll be a massive shock, oil prices, the risk of a global recession, like it happened after Yom Kippur, after the Iranian Revolution, and after the Iraq invasion of Kuwait. So that's a long-term story. Secondly, on energy policy, you have to deal not only with supply, and there is a variety of sources of new supply, both alternative green economy, you name it, and the new fossil fuels like shale and you name it, or nuclear. But you have to deal also on the demand side. On the demand side, we're doing relatively little. In my view, the right solution around the world will be a carbon tax, something that politically looks like mission impossible in the US. Now, let's think about sources of energy that is not just oil. I think nuclear is going to be a bit of a problem because of political concerns after Fukushima, especially, not just in Japan,
Nouriel,
but even in the United States.
Let me interrupt for a moment on the pace of change. As a U.S. citizen, all of us in school studied Pearl Harbor and the enormous attack and what occurred in Pearl Harbor. People did not think the United States would be mobilized. But Henry Ford and Kaiser and others immediately turned their factories to producing ships, tanks, etc. And I think both the Japanese and the Germans vastly underestimated the ability to the U.S. to mobilize. Number two, China has already set up an institute for shale. The United States might be slower. China is not. And
yeah, but let's speak about, first of all, I was speaking about nuclear power that's going to be constrained, and alternative energy. I'm all in favor of alternative, solar, wind, all the other stuff, but we know it's going to be limited. So let's talk about shale gas. There is an opportunity, but the question is how long it's going to take. I think people are a bit too optimistic about how fast this shale revolution is going to occur for the following reason. The supply of new shale now is increasing very sharply because everybody's trying to find in the ground and using technology. Let's leave aside all the environmental concerns. There's going to be an issue, maybe not in the US, but certainly in Europe. So supplies increase more than demand, and now prices of shale of oil and natural gas, of natural gas have collapsed. You have $2 that is really very low. So the economic incentive to do more drilling may be reduced unless demand starts to increase as fast as supply, because that's what you want. You want the increase in supply to be satisfied by an increase in demand. And the increase in demand, in my view, is going to occur much more slowly for the following reason. Like take, for example, the idea of transforming an entire, say, vehicle, both autos and trucks, to gas. No one is doing it right now. No one is doing it because if you have to change the engine today, it's going to cost $50,000 for a truck or $20,000 for a car. Nobody's doing it. They're not even producers of cars that are decided to build the engines are going to be very expensive. You have a whole issue about then the distribution of gas, how you convert all the gas fuel stations into natural gas and so on. So demand is not increasing fast enough. It's going to take probably 20, 30 years until you convert just the trucks, let alone the autos, into gas. And if demand doesn't increase fast enough with the supply, and the supply increases too fast because everybody's now investing into shale, you'll have a sharp reduction in prices, then the supply response is going to become more limited, and this thing's going to take longer than otherwise. I think that people believe that in 5 years from now we're going to be energy independent because of the shale revolution. I think people are deluding themselves. It's going to be maybe a 20-year story. So it's going to happen, but it's going to happen much more slowly than we do expect. So right, I do believe in this story, but I don't think it's going to be a short-term story.
Okay,
not even 5 to 10 years. I think it's more like a 10 to 20-year story.
All right, so I think I would answer that with leadership. All the trucks.
Where is the leadership? We haven't had an energy policy for 40 years in spite of major geopolitical shocks. You would have thought after Yom Kippur, after the Iranian Revolution, after the Iraqi invasion of Kuwait, after the Arab Spring, there'll be a change in energy policy. Which energy policy do we have in the United States? I'm not sure we do. We talk about it, but I'm not sure we do. And I said the private sector is moving, but unless you mobilize also incentives, for example, you have to give subsidies to tell people, truckers, get a new truck or convert your truck into gas. Do we give those subsidies or incentives? No. So you need public policy to achieve that increase in demand. It's not going to occur just because the market is doing it, or the market is going to do it, but it's going to take too long.
All right. Well, Boone Pickens already put forth a plan, as you know, Nouriel, that carried the House and had 51 votes in the Senate against 47. So time will tell, and we'll see what leadership is. But I believe if gas is going to be 15 to 20 in Korea and China this summer, and it's 2 in the U.S., that we don't need to rely just on the U.S. to move that gas. Many people will be focused. And if I can save $40,000 a year on my truck per year by using natural gas instead of oil, at some point I might make that economic decision if I can recover it in 6 months to a year in my investment. So I think we have some agreement that there's a potential dramatic change, and the issue is what is the timing of when this can occur. And I think my point is there's a wake-up call today, and a price 8 times higher in Korea than the United States is a wake-up call for the for-profit side to address. And whether it's the U.S. or others, this will change far faster than you think. Let's move to our next problems. So let's go to problem 3 and 4. I'll give you 2 at a time.
Well, 3 and 4, I would say immediately, of course, the problems of Europe, or specifically the periphery of the Eurozone, are severe. Actually, I'll be at the luncheon today discussing with another panel in much more detail for an hour what's happening in the Eurozone. I wrote yesterday for the clients of my economic consultancy a long piece titled 12 Drivers to a Slow Motion Train Wreck in the Eurozone that summarizes it. I'm not going to go through the 12 points right now, but I would suggest that, in the latest data that came out this morning, the PMIs in the Eurozone suggest first there is a deepening recession in the periphery of Eurozone. Now even the core of the Eurozone is contracting, is getting worse. And in my view, that recession is going to get worse. One, because while fiscal austerity is necessary in the short term, raising tax and cutting spending makes the recession worse. 2, because the euro is too strong. Germany is uber competitive, can live with a euro at 1.3, but for the periphery, the lost competitiveness, the euro should be 30% lower. That's not happening. 3, there is a massive credit crunch in the periphery of the Eurozone because the banks don't have enough capital and they are deleveraging and reaching their capital targets by selling assets and contracting credit. 4, if we worry about oil prices being high in the United States, it's even worse in Europe because there are high taxes, and while in the US half of the domestic demand is satisfied by domestic production, almost 100% of the Eurozone consumption comes from imports, so the oil shock is severe. And 5, I would say, politically, the Eurozone right now is becoming a mess. In the periphery, there is what I call an austerity fatigue, because people are saying, austerity, austerity, where is growth? If there is no growth, eventually the social and political backlash against the austerity is going to become overwhelming. You know, the parties in Greece might want default and exit today, might get 50% of the vote. Even France might go for Hollande. The Irish might vote against the referendum for fiscal austerity. There is austerity fatigue in Italy and Spain as the recession is becoming a depression. And in the core of the Eurozone, instead of austerity fatigue, there is a bailout fatigue. I mean, I talk to Germans or people in Austria or Netherlands or in Finland, and they say, these Greeks had a big, fat Greek wedding for the last 20 years. We gave them a first bailout. We gave them a second bailout. We gave them a 75% debt reduction, and they're not still doing any effort. So they say enough is enough. At some point, we'll have to pull the plug, let them default and exit. And once it starts in Greece, could be Portugal and others. So I would say the problems of the Eurozone, in my view, are severe, and they're getting worse, and the recession in the Eurozone is getting worse, is not bottoming out. And I think that's going to be certainly a tail risk both for the economies and for financial markets.
All right, well, this is such a large area. Maybe we'll just start with the Eurozone.
Yeah.
I want to differentiate in response first the countries from the companies. So your major companies in the world see things. Now here's a look at dispersion in the Eurozone. So when we talk about the Eurozone, it is not homogeneous. So Norway, Switzerland, obviously very small Luxembourg, Sweden, Finland, Denmark, Netherlands, etc., are much different in a sense than if we go to the other side and start talking Ireland, Italy, Spain, etc., Portugal. And so the issue here is, if we look at the cash of corporations as a percentage of the GDP, companies have liquefied themselves throughout the world. The cash as a percentage of the GDP has increased substantially. $30 trillion have moved. Now, yes, the banks are large relative to the size of the economy. You can see, for example, that Banco Santander assets are bigger than the economy of Spain. However, that includes Latin America, which has been booming for them, and so the assets appear larger. And I think you're going to see a trend, just like we saw in the refinancing of corporations. Europe has done a great deal of the financing in Asia. Asia does not need European banks to finance it. There's plenty of reserves in China and other countries. And so whether it's airplanes, ships, containers, whatever it might be, there's a tremendous chance to see them decline from now. Now, if we take a look, for example, in slide 50, if we could pull that slide up, you can see here what has happened here as corporate cash balances. And this is only in 2009. So if you go to South Korea, for example, my guess is corporate cash balances now exceed 30% of the GDP of the country. Corporations themselves around the world, as they did in the mid-70s, stepped up and they could finance their customers, their suppliers, enormous excess cash. When we talked all about this liquidity wall, which people said, boy, there's so much maturities in 2008, 9, 10, 11, 12, books that were written here about these walls of maturity. Our response here at the Global Conference is they'll be refinanced. And if you look here, just at the U.S. non-investment grade debt, there's almost nothing maturing in 2012, 13, 14. Okay, it has been pushed out and refinanced well ahead of time, and today it's being refinanced at actually lower rates, not higher rates. So the first question is, fundamentally, the companies are stronger than the financial institutions, and they're stronger, excuse me, than the countries. So We're so focused on the countries. Now, I will accept your premise, as Adam Smith has suggested, that once debt levels of a country get to a certain level, they're never fully repaid. Now, in two ways they're not fully repaid. One, you just devalue your currency, and the other is you make a deal to pay it off at a discount. And there is long histories of default of European countries on their sovereign debt. And the reason Adam Smith told us that is what you've outlined. Austerity plans only work so long. You can only ask people to sacrifice so long, and after that, it's over. And because the next political leader promises that they're not going to support an austerity plan, and the majority of people within a country go for it. So there is no surprise of the change in governments. The same thing in the United States today. You cannot ask the American people to sacrifice anymore. They've already believed they have sacrificed long enough. And therefore,
they've not even started to sacrifice in the U.S.
That's not how, you're talking about what they've done versus what they think. And therefore, we should not underestimate the fact that the rest of the world is awash in liquidity. They can take the assets from these European banks. They have to shrink in size because they're too large relative to the economy. Europe no longer has to finance Asia. It doesn't need to finance Latin America. It doesn't need to finance the United States. And it can focus on their assets remaining in Europe. The question I see that I will support you on is, what are we going to do about the euro? And you're obviously on a panel later with many experts to discuss that. But we've taken away the ability of Greece to devalue their currency. And obviously their production costs are higher than Germany. We've taken the way for Italy to devalue the currency. And I brought for you, in case you didn't have it recently, Nouriel, the 1 million lira. You know, this was a 1 million lira coin. There's not in circulation in use because of the euro, but it might come back. It might come back.
Yeah. I grew up in Italy, so you can give it to me. It might be worth a couple of bucks, probably, once they go back to the lira.
And I've noticed...
Given that the devaluations are going to occur.
And I noticed...
It's not going to be a Zimbabwe, but...
Well, I'll also give you 100 trillion Zimbabwe dollar, because I know you haven't been traveling.
Doesn't even buy a loaf of bread, right? Yeah.
But one of the things we've seen is that the minute you begin to devalue your currency, your economy takes off, okay, and the stock markets and other real assets appreciate. And I would say to you, the challenge in Southern Europe is what is going to happen that's due to the fact they don't have their own currency. And can someone be creative enough to give them the opportunity to make themselves competitive? Now, as it relates to Germany, the German citizen has been the major beneficiary of the fact that it's tied into the euro. The Swiss francs the U.S. has depreciated maybe 70% versus the Swiss franc. Okay, we can only imagine where the mark would be selling if it actually had its own currency today. And my guess is you'd have labor costs, production costs skyrocket in Germany if it's separated from the euro. So as the Germans decide what they want to do.
Okay. I think that there are issues about what you do with the Eurozone, but I think there was a broader question you brought up that was that the balance sheet and the P&Ls of high-grade corporates in
Not
the US,
even high
in
grade.
Europe.
High yield has refinanced too.
No, they've refinanced, but let's say the P&Ls and the balance sheets are stronger for the high grade. The ones that are high yield have been able to refinance given the spreads have narrowed very much. But
leverage. And reduce leverage.
Reduce leverage and so on. So the corporate sector, both in advanced economies, including even the best corporates in Europe, let alone those in emerging market, is doing well. And that's a fair point. And I said at the beginning, one of the elements of strength in the global economy is the balance sheets and the P&Ls of corporates. But let's think about the balance sheets of the rest of the economy. The balance sheets of governments in advanced economies, both central government, state and local, we know are a disaster. There is already a sovereign debt crisis in part of the Eurozone, but as we know, there's a train wreck potentially in the United States, in Japan, in the UK, in other advanced economies.
We'll get to the United States later.
But I'm saying, you have to look at those balance sheets. The balance sheets of many households in country where there was a housing or real estate or other types of credit bubble are still strained. Debt servicing payments have been reduced through easy money, but those debt levels remain high. And the balance sheets of financial institutions, you cannot lump them all together. They're not as bad in the United States, where they've done lots of stuff. In the Eurozone are still extremely fragile. So my point is, you have one sector of the economy that corporate is doing well, all the other ones are shaky. And that corporate sector, by the way, that is highly profitable, efficient, has become lean and mean, is not spending. They're hoarding all this cash, given all the policy, regulatory, taxation, and macro and geopolitical uncertainty. So they're not spending. I mean, the first quarter of this year, CapEx spending, but the corporate sector in the US was actually negative. So, and if they're spending, they're not spending in slow-growing advanced economies. They're going to spend more, of course, in fast-growing emerging markets. So my point is that one sector being okay is helpful, but all the other ones are in trouble. And two, eventually, if the government is in trouble, we'll have to start taxing. And some of the taxes are going to be taxes on capital income, on wealth. They're going to also, especially in Europe, have a negative effect on corporate profitability. So you cannot separate the sovereign risk from the corporate, the banking risk. Right? Banking risk became sovereign risk when they decided to socialize the private losses, but now sovereign risk is becoming banking risk because a good chunk of the assets or the debt of the sovereign are held by the banking system, or the ability of taxing the corporate sector is going to be further negative for economic growth. So saying that the corporates are fine, it's good, but lots of things are not fine. Now, in the Eurozone, I think you correctly pointed out, you need a massive real depreciation of the euro. It can occur either through a nominal depreciation of the euro, but since Germany is uber competitive, the euro is sticking at 1.3, is not falling to parity. The other way of doing it is structural reforms, increase productivity growth. It took Germany 10, 15 years. If Spain, Portugal, Greece start today, the benefits are going to be seen only 10 years from now. The third option for a real depreciation, if you don't have nominal depreciation, is deflation. You reduce prices and wages by 30%. Argentina tried the deflation route to a real depreciation and led to a severe depression, and they gave up and defaulted and devalued. So if you cannot either devalue the euro to a real depreciation, inflate yourself, or grow yourself out of this problem, or deflation is not going to work, the only other solution is going to be to give up the euro and go to a national currency. But if enough of those countries were to do that, the collateral damage in terms of losses for the creditors are going to be massive. So breaking up is going to be a mess in the Eurozone. It's not going to be easy. And that's a fundamental problem that is faced by the Eurozone. You need to have a real depreciation. It's not occurring fast enough. And therefore, the periphery's recession may become a depression. And eventually, something's going to snap politically, and there may be a breakup.
Okay,
but the financial contagion, not just within the Eurozone, but also across the world, could be significant. We cannot say, rightly or wrongly, there is still meaningful exposure of European banks. They finance, for example, trade financing in Asia or throughout Latin America. The exposure of European banks to Central Europe is massive. The one of Spanish banks to Latin America is significant. If something disorderly, either disorderly default and or disorderly breakup were to occur in the Eurozone, certainly the financial contagion will be significant.
Okay, so you've thrown out only 300 or 400 items in the last 5 or 10 minutes. So let's start with just a few. Number one, these are many of these companies are international corporations that have liquidity. And the lessons of Latin America and Asia, et cetera, in the 70s, 80s, 90s, was that the corporations did far better than the governments, even when the governments defaulted and had liquidity. Bank Santander has assets in Latin America that would be extremely valuable if separated. And so the potential opportunity...
Unless Argentina nationalized those assets.
Well, even Argentina pays...
Or Bolivia.
Even Argentina.
Or Venezuela.
I have a feeling...
Or Ecuador, or a few other populist governments in Latin America, because there is a resource nationalism and other things happening as well.
Well, that's true. But on the other side of the ledger, the largest economy in South America by far is Brazil, which we believe someday will be the 4th largest economy in the world. And I think we have to recognize that the population of South America and Latin America today combined is larger than the population of Europe. And as the percentage of the economy every year shifts away, we have to get relative values from that standpoint. I do, and to say the euro needs to be devalued, it'd be very interesting to see whether the world, China, et cetera, could take a substantial devaluation of the euro relative to the productivity of Germany from that standpoint. And so the reason the euro is a confusing currency is we don't know if it's Northern Europe and dramatically undervalued, or it's Southern Europe and dramatically overvalued. So it hangs in there at 130 plus or minus because we don't know which way it's going right now from that standpoint.
You're right.
And lastly, I would say there's enormous wealth that's been accumulated for centuries in individuals throughout Europe. And whether you see it in Switzerland and others, or whether it's the people in the Middle East that have moved their money in and feel very comfortable owning homes in the UK or other places or France, etc. today. And lastly, I want to just make my last point until we move on to another part of the world. And that is that we have to factor in immigration. Today, the tourist of choice is from China. A tourist from China spends almost 100% more than a tourist from Europe today when they come visit the United States. And if we had, umpteen, whatever it is, 1 million to 30 million people from Asia move to Europe. We saw a recent poll in China, and we can get to the reasons for it, but more than 60% of every single person worth more than 1.6 million in the United States in this poll who lives in China wants to live either in Europe or the United States. Now, out of that percentage, 2/3 of them want to live in the United States and 1/3 want to live in Europe today. And we could talk about all the reasons they want to do that, but the movement of the world's largest asset, human capital, significant movement would move financial capital into Europe, would move new businesses, new creativity, highly motivated, talented people. The question is, could that ever happen in Europe in large numbers? And I think we could wonder with the issues of unemployment and ethnic issues, whether that can. It's already happened here in the United States. Right. So that could, immigration, the movement of people, could have a dramatic effect on Europe. I just wanted to put that.
Yeah, I mean, I would say the following thing. First of all, demographic problems that lead to unfunded liability from healthcare for the elderly and social security system are even more severe in Europe and in Japan, because aging of population in Europe and Japan is more severe than the United States. And in the US, we've also had migration into the US has helped us in terms of dealing with some of those unfunded liability. And in spite of that, even the US has significant unfunded liabilities. Now, in the Eurozone right now, look what's happening in France, where not just the left, but even Sarkozy, let alone Le Pen and the right, are bashing migration. Even in the core of the Eurozone, in the Netherlands, there is these anti-immigration movements and so on. You have unemployment rate this morning, almost 11% in the Eurozone. Wrongly, in my view, they're blaming the migrants. But that's a situation we're facing right now, let alone Japan, that culturally shouldn't let millions of people into the country. They've never done it, and the chances of doing it are very small. So unfortunately, the kind of migrants that have come to Europe have been from the Middle East, from sub-Saharan Africa, from North Africa, that actually are working hard and helping what's going on in those countries. But the perception, because of culture and other things, is that we don't want them, especially when unemployment is rising and they have a severe recession. So yes, ideally, you'd like the successful, dynamic entrepreneurs of Asia around the world to come to Europe. Unfortunately, I think they're going to come to the United States. They're not going to come to Europe, given what's happening right now, Europe in terms of economic malaise and a political system that is really stalled in terms of ability of doing structural reform.
So we're going to move on.
If I had an option from China, I would come to the US. I wouldn't come to Europe. Most likely, the rich Chinese and Indians are going to retire in Europe and buy villas. And Europe might become the Florida for China, India, and the rich people in emerging markets. So maybe you build healthcare, hospitals, and other things. There is art, culture, good food, design, and whatever not. But if that's the future of the periphery of the Eurozone, it's not a great future. It's better than an alternative, but I'm saying I don't see the dynamic people from emerging markets wanting to rush in the Eurozone, frankly. That's unlikely.
You're going to get another chance to address the Eurozone.
Yeah.
And many of the issues that they face, we face here in the United States. I would suggest to you that financial markets in the United States are much stronger today. Financial institutions are stronger. Financial institutions in Asia are very strong. Financial institutions in South America are very strong. And there's plenty of people lined up to take the assets, particularly of European financial institutions that exist outside of Europe, and help liquefy and shrink those. And many of the corporations around the world would stand by to buy companies also that are headquartered in Europe, but time will tell. Let's turn our attention now to the United States.
Well, in the US, I would say the following thing. In relative terms, you could say US is doing better. In the Eurozone, you have a recession. In the UK, you have a recession. In Japan, you've had economic stagnation for the last 20 years since the collapse of their equity and real estate bubble. So if you're speaking in relative terms, the fact that we have 2% growth in the United States, it's good news. And the fact that asset prices have been rising is good news. The fact that the banks have recapitalized is good news. The fact that the corporates are strong and profitable and dynamic and entrepreneurial is good news. My worries about the United States are that in some dimensions we have kicked the can down the road. There was front-loaded fiscal austerity in the Eurozone and the UK. That's why they're going into a recession. But in the US, real wages, by the way, are not growing. The reason why consumption growth in the last few quarters has been okay, and it's been just okay, is not because real wages before taxes and transfers are growing. They're flat and actually falling. What has sustained a real disposable income growth that has been actually relatively mediocre has been another round, 1.4 trillion of tax cuts and transfer payments in 2010, 11 and 12 alone, that has been all financed by another 1.4 trillion of public debt. So we have essentially slowed down the deleveraging of the household sector that is still having very high debt ratios and has very anemic growth of real wages, because real wages are falling, only with further releveraging of the public sector. That means the following thing. By next year, we know there is a huge fiscal cliff. Now, if everything were to expire, all the increases in automatic spending cuts, all the tax cuts that are expiring, dividends, capital gains, income, payroll, all the phase out of transfer payments to state and local government unemployment benefits, the estimate of that fiscal cliff is going to be 600 billion or 4% of GDP. Of course, that's not going to happen because otherwise we'll have a nasty recession. But suppose that something happened next year. Some transfer payments are going to be phased out. Some taxes are going to be increased. Some automatic spending cuts are going to be done. Suppose you have even a fiscal drag of 0.5 to 1% of GDP. In an economy is growing only 2% today, that slows down growth towards 1% from 2%. And once then you raise some taxes and reduce some transfer payments, the real disposable income growth is going to slow down, and that's going to lead to another further slowdown of consumption growth. So the optimists today are saying US is on a cusp of a self-sustaining recovery. We're going to go this year towards growth of 3%, and next year is going to accelerate to above trend growth. My view of it is the data suggests that we'll be lucky if this year we're going to grow barely 2%, and the latest economic data, including first quarter GDP growth, say we're barely growing 2%. And next year, not only we're not going to accelerate, but because of the fiscal drag and the fiscal cliff inducing some renewed deleveraging of the household sector, we're going to have actually a slowdown of growth, and we may be going back to stalled speed in the US economy. Now, the dilemma we're facing is the following one. On one side, our fiscal policy, of course, is unsustainable. We cannot run 8-9% of GDP fiscal deficit forever. Otherwise, eventually, we may end up like Europe, in spite of being a country that can monetize deficit, in spite of having the dollar as a major reserve currency. So eventually, we have to do the fiscal consolidation. However, on the other side, if you front-load that fiscal consolidation, like it was done in the Eurozone and the UK, then the risk of a double dip becomes severe. And on top of it, you have now this gridlock in Congress, where one party is vetoing any tax increase, the other party is vetoing spending cuts. And if you think about the deficit, it went from 0 to almost 10% of GDP. Fair enough, spending went from 19% of GDP to 24. We have to cut it back. We have to reform entitlements. On the other side, revenues at the federal level that were 19% of GDP last year were 14. So there is no way we're going to do the fiscal adjustment only on the spending side. We have to reform entitlement, but unfortunately we have to raise taxes, and not just for the rich. Eventually to also raise taxes for the middle class. And we have one party vetoing the tax increases, the other party vetoing the entitlement spending, and next year is going to be just worse than before. Okay. The gridlock is not going to be any better after the election, regardless of whether Obama is elected or Romney is elected, because if Obama is elected, he's not going to have 60 votes in the Senate. If Romney is elected, he's not going to have 60 votes in the Senate. So the Democrats under the Romney administration can veto any entitlement reform because they don't have 60 votes in the Senate. So if there is gridlock, it's going to get worse.
Okay.
Or you think that the two parties are going to get together and reach a happy agreement on what needs to be done for the country?
All right, we need to leave a little time for Asia and the BRIC nations. So
yeah, we still.
No, that we have less time than it shows there. So
okay.
Let's talk about the United States. Obviously, 3 years ago we sat here and I mentioned to you that I thought this was similar to 73, 74, and we were repeating. So if we just take a look at the stock market, which is back up where it was, but if we compare that stock market to the 73, 76 period to what just occurred, it's pretty much traced what we suggested 3 years ago. And so you can look at that here and just see kind of what's occurred. That's number one.
Yeah. But for the last 10 years, the stock market has been flat.
But that's
right?
not
flat.
the point. If the point is, the point is tens of trillions of dollars of value has been created.
After they've been destroyed during the financial crisis, right? We're not even at the level. We're still at 1,300. The peak was around 14 something.
Let's step back. If I asked you, if you had 100 million and it went to 30 and it went back to 100, I have a feeling you'd be feeling better. You wouldn't be telling me, you know, Mike, I haven't covered much ground.
No, but I'm saying if I'm a saver and I have to retire and I put most of my money into, the 401ks and IRAs, and most of it was in equity, for the last 10, 12 years, I've gotten zero return. Zero return.
That is true.
And that's an issue. It's a problem. And I'm getting zero or close to zero on short-term treasuries, and I'm getting less than 2% on 10-year bonds. So how I'm going to retire? How I'm going to retire, and where the money is coming from? And Social Security is bankrupt. So, and the corporate pension funds, as you know, are also totally unfunded, if not insolvent. So.
Okay, you're eating into my time here.
Please.
Not everyone has had their money in the stock market. Some people have had their money in gold. Okay, and this is now worth $1,600 to $1,700. Number two, corporations in the United States.
It's less than 1% of the global benchmark. Come on, you cannot tell. If everybody had gone into gold, then they'll be rich. We have stocks and bonds. If you take a benchmark,
number one is securities, and I can assure you, Nouriel, you might, because you suggested people would be 95% in cash, maybe you haven't benefited as much when market went up 100%.
No, I switched back into, I switched back, all my 401k are in equities, actually. Good. And remain in equities, so I was in cash in 07, 08 when market fell 2/3, and I did right.
But I would say to you, the wealth effect. Next, investments in emerging countries, investments in high-yield debt, and investments in government securities, have performed tremendously in the past decade and offered very high rates of return, and not everyone has had their money in the S&P 500. But if we look at the United States, let's accept, as I've pointed out in that paper, Where's Sputnik, that the United States has not addressed entitlements. But if we look at three core areas of the United States, it's been its energy policy, and the shipping of hundreds of billions of dollars overseas, it's quite possible that's coming to an end. We might debate when it's coming to an end. Number two, the infatuation with a home. Even when the government has got interest rates at 3%, middle class and lower middle class now recognizes that what they should have known all the time, that a house is not the world's greatest investment. The price has gone down more over a long period of time, 65 in the last 120 years, and that they've not been able to get them to rush immediately in this area. And the third, the educational systems and the challenges we have, and I'm sure there was more than a dozen panels at the Global Conference this year with a focus on this area. The United States financial institutions are very strong today as they continue to deleverage, and their liquidity has never been higher. The liquidity overall in the country has almost doubled the percentage of cash that individuals are holding as a percentage of their net worth. And the tremendous advantage the United States has is it borrows in its own currency.
Yeah.
So it can, if it chooses to, at the end, devalue by having the currency be worth less and have inflation solve many of the problems today. But I would agree with you that we need leadership, and the challenge after the election, I would be actually more optimistic after the election than you, and that the challenges are so well laid out here that we will respond in some call, and leadership will in some call request what President Kennedy did and ask, what can you do for the nation, not what the nation can do for you. And let's go to the third one besides education, housing, and that would be the gaining of weight in America. That has occurred only in the last 20 years. It cost the country $1 trillion. Every single person, no matter how poor they are, can step back and try to figure out they're going to walk for America, and what we could do in productivity and healthcare costs. The number one stimulus for the United States and Europe is actually the elimination of heart disease and cancer as a cause of death. And the advancements which will be unfolding in the next 12 to 24 months hold the promise, just like it did in polio, that we're going to be able to substantially reduce the rate. It is worth almost $120 trillion to the U.S. economy, the elimination of heart disease and cancer. And so there are some upsides we can get that could substantially reduce medical costs and at the same time substantially increase productivity. But let's move to the BRICS and China.
Yeah. Can I make just one point on the U.S., and the long term might be brighter than the short term. But
and immigration, I haven't even.
But let me say one thing about the short term. We did a $2 trillion fiscal stimulus. We've done $2.8 trillion of QE on top of zero policy rates for as far as I can see. We backstopped the entire financial system. And after all this, and it's 4 years of this, we're still growing barely 2% below trend, and unemployment is above 8%. So think about all the stimulus give us a measly 2% growth. That's the best we're doing. So we have some macro challenges, even if the future may be bright in terms of immigration, technology, and lots of other stuff. You know, Keynes used to say that in the long run, we're dead. The reality is actually, if we can reach the long run, maybe the long run is the bright future that you are describing. The risk is we may be dead in the short run because we have significant fiscal, financial, and macroeconomic problems. We have to survive to the short run to get the bright long run of energy and technology and all the other things that you're thinking about, science and medicine. I think it's a problem for the U.S.
Okay, I guess we're going to save till next year the China, the BRICS, et cetera. We'll stay with the United States to the end from that standpoint. I think one of the things I would say to you is you need to define whether you're talking about symptoms or cause. I might argue one of our challenges, and maybe the challenge in the United States on unemployment, is not the economy. We've identified that there's 70 million jobs that might be available in America if the citizens were qualified for those jobs. And so we're well aware of the education challenges. And it's that education and talent in the employee workforce that might be causing us problems in unemployment that we need to address. So we need to decide whether it's the symptom or the actual cause from that standpoint. You know, 2 years ago, many people were talking about this overhang of debt and lack of liquidity. That is gone. And obviously, you can't have a country continue where the government, let's say, borrows $1 trillion and the Federal Reserve buys $650 billion and foreign countries buy $350 billion. That does not work. But every single company in this country is going to have the opportunity to borrow at a lower cost, lock it in. And we have the chance here to change the utility curve of America. And as we've discussed, that utility curve of America, bribing the middle class to believe and misleading them that the size of your house was the most important thing for your family, and living farther away from where you work so you can spend more in transportation and spend less with your children, that we're going to drop the price of housing by interest rates and the drop in prices, and that you only should invest 2% of your money in the, quote, tutoring of your children. And so we have a chance in America here, in a wake-up call, to respond here by reallocating the middle class money, getting in better shape physically, losing weight, and returning just to the weight we were in '91, substantially increasing productivity and reducing healthcare costs, and a chance here in energy for an explosion of opportunity. But the underlying challenge might be the education of the American people, a change in immigration policies. You know, when the United States only has 5% or so of the world's population, but my guess is 20 to 25% of the people in the world would like to live in the United States if they could, and my guess is 50% of the wealthiest people, most educated people, would like to live in the United States. And the American dream maybe isn't as live and well as it should be in America, but the American dream, as you travel the world, is with us around the world. And so with that, we're going to have to close today. To be continued. Thank you.